The Arizona desert has a particular kind of silence. It is not peaceful. It is not empty. It is a silence that absorbs sound and swallows movement, a landscape so vast that a single person can disappear within it without leaving much behind. On a summer morning in 2021, a young geologist named Daniel Robinson stepped away from his worksite somewhere outside Buckeye. He told a coworker he would be back in a few minutes after checking another survey point nearby. He never returned. Days later, his vehicle was discovered abandoned in the desert. The windows were open. His wallet and phone were still inside. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing appeared obviously violent. Yet the man himself was gone, as if the desert had quietly erased him from the landscape. What began as a routine workday would soon transform into one of the most unsettling unsolved disappearances in recent Arizona memory. And with every new detail uncovered, the story only seemed to become stranger. Before the disappearance, life in the outskirts of Buckeye moved at a slow and predictable rhythm. The town sits on the western edge of the massive urban sprawl surrounding Phoenix, where new neighborhoods steadily expand into the surrounding desert. Construction sites appear beside dry riverbeds. Survey stakes rise from red dust. The desert, once empty, is slowly being measured, mapped, and transformed. Daytime temperatures regularly climb above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat shimmers above the dirt roads that stretch between drilling sites, solar fields, and geological survey areas. For many young engineers and geologists, however, this environment represents opportunity. Beneath the harsh sun lies the beginning of a career. Each field survey, each sample taken from the ground, is another step toward understanding the hidden structure of the land. For Daniel Robinson, this desert was not simply a job location. It was the starting point of a life he had worked toward for years. Everything appeared to be moving forward exactly as planned until the morning of June 2021. At the time of his disappearance, Daniel Robinson was just 24 years old. He had recently graduated with a degree in geology from College of Charleston. Like many graduates entering the field sciences, he had taken his first professional position with a company conducting groundwater and geological surveys across rural Arizona. Those who knew Daniel often described him with the same set of words: intelligent, curious, optimistic. He carried a quiet determination that had shaped his life since childhood. Daniel had been born with a condition that left his right forearm underdeveloped. For many people, such a physical difference might have become a limitation or a reason to retreat from physically demanding careers. For Daniel, it never became either. Instead, it became something else entirely, a reminder that ability could be defined by persistence rather than appearance. During his college years, Daniel frequently joined field research trips. He spent long days outdoors studying rock formations, soil layers, and water systems beneath the surface of the earth. Friends recalled that he spoke passionately about working in the field rather than sitting behind a desk. He wanted to be outside, walking across land that still held geological secrets. His family remained back in South Carolina, thousands of miles away. His father, David Robinson, would later become one of the most determined voices searching for answers after his son vanished. But before any of that happened, Daniel's life appeared ordinary in the best possible way. He called home often. He talked about the new environment in Arizona, the endless desert roads, and the sense that he was finally beginning the career he had envisioned since college. Those who spoke with him during those early weeks said he sounded excited about the future. There was nothing in those conversations that suggested his life was about to disappear into uncertainty. During his time in Arizona, Daniel maintained a relatively small social circle with most interactions centered around co-workers from the Geological Survey Company. Together, they traveled to remote desert sites near Buckeye, collecting data, inspecting water wells, and mapping underground resources. Colleagues described him as friendly, focused, and dependable, someone who handled harsh conditions without complaint. Yet in the weeks before his disappearance, a few noticed subtle shifts in his mood, not alarming, but enough to suggest something personal lingered beneath the surface. Reports later suggested that Daniel had recently ended a brief romantic relationship, with a woman he met in the Phoenix area. The connection was short-lived, but messages reviewed afterward indicated a sense of disappointment. Some texts hinted at quiet sadness, even confusion about how things ended. Still, those closest to him did not believe this moment had deeply shaken him. Friends said he continued planning his work, his future, and the life he was building in Arizona. He spoke about career growth, new opportunities, and projects he hoped to pursue. That contrast now feels difficult to ignore. If Daniel was looking ahead, then something must have interrupted that path without warning. The desert where he worked stretched endlessly, both striking and indifferent. Dirt roads cut through open land, scattered with low hills and stone. By day, heat shimmered across the surface. By night, darkness settled completely, broken only by distant headlights moving through silence. In places like this, isolation is part of the job. Survey crews move far beyond paved roads, into terrain where communication fades and help is never immediate. If something goes wrong, hours can pass before anyone notices. For trained geologists, this environment is routine, even predictable. But when someone disappears completely, the desert shifts in meaning. It becomes something less understood, not empty but indifferent, not silent but absorbing. A place where a single presence can vanish without resistance, and none of the people working alongside Daniel Robinson could have imagined how quickly everything would change. What began as an ordinary morning would soon unravel into something far more unsettling, a disappearance without clear cause, a story without resolution. Within days, his name would spread across news reports and missing person alerts, echoing far beyond the desert itself. And at the center of it all remained one question, unanswered and persistent. What truly happened out there in that vast and silent landscape? Morning arrives quickly in the Arizona desert. By early hours, the sun already burns against the ground, turning dry soil into a reflective surface of heat and dust. On June 23, 2021, the workday began much like any other for Daniel Robinson. He had been assigned to a groundwater survey site located in a remote desert area outside Buckeye, part of the growing development corridor west of Phoenix. The job required patience and repetition. Surveying underground water sources involved measuring terrain, checking equipment, and traveling between scattered points in the desert landscape. It was quiet work, often performed miles away from the nearest paved road. Around 9:15 that morning, one of Daniel's co-workers saw him preparing to leave the immediate survey area. Daniel climbed into his gray Jeep Renegade, a compact SUV that had become a familiar sight around the worksite. According to that co-worker, Daniel briefly mentioned he planned to drive around the area to check another survey location nearby. The statement sounded routine. Field engineers often moved between checkpoints throughout the morning. No one saw any reason to question it. Daniel drove away across the dusty terrain, and that was the last confirmed moment anyone saw him. Minutes passed, then an hour. Work continued as normal. The team focused on measurements and documentation beneath the relentless desert sun. At first, Daniel's absence did not seem unusual. Field tasks often pulled workers in different directions across large distances. But as time passed, something subtle began to change. He did not return. No one saw his Jeep driving back toward the worksite. No one reported hearing a crash or mechanical failure. There was no sign of distress, no sudden radio communication asking for help. Even more puzzling was what investigators would later discover inside the vehicle itself. Several of Daniel's most important personal belongings remained there, including his wallet and his phone. These were not the kinds of items people typically leave behind intentionally, especially in a remote desert environment where communication could mean the difference between safety and danger. And yet the man who owned them seemed to have vanished entirely. Later analysis of available data suggested that Daniel's Jeep did not travel very far from the general survey area that morning. Vehicle movement patterns indicated a relatively short drive through the surrounding desert terrain. After that brief movement, however, the trail seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. The landscape around Buckeye contains a complex network of dirt paths carved by years of industrial activity. Old mining routes, construction access roads, and geological survey trails weave through the desert in dozens of directions. Many of these paths are unmarked and rarely used. Some lead to abandoned excavation sites or dry wells. Others simply fade into open desert after a few miles. In places like this, a single wrong turn can lead a vehicle far from the view of anyone nearby. There are no traffic cameras watching these roads. There are no storefronts, no houses, and often no reliable cell signal. The desert provides enormous freedom of movement. But it also offers an equally enormous opportunity for something to disappear without witnesses. Days began to pass without contact from Daniel. At first, co-workers assumed he had taken personal leave or was dealing with a minor situation outside work. But when he failed to respond to calls and messages, concern slowly turned into alarm. Back in South Carolina, Daniel's family began noticing the same unsettling silence. For someone who regularly communicated with his parents, the sudden absence of messages felt wrong. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages remained unread. The quiet stretched across several days. Eventually, Daniel's father, David Robinson, made a decision that would mark the beginning of a long and relentless search. He boarded a flight and traveled across the country to Arizona, determined to understand what had happened to his son. Once there, the search began close to the last known location where Daniel had been working. Volunteers, co-workers, and local authorities began scanning areas of desert near the survey site. The terrain was vast, but the hope remained that perhaps Daniel had experienced a minor accident and was waiting somewhere nearby for help. Weeks passed with little progress. Then came a discovery that changed the direction of the investigation. Daniel's Jeep Renegade was eventually located deep within the desert, several miles from where he had last been seen. The vehicle had overturned and come to rest inside a small desert ravine. From a distance, it looked like the aftermath of a serious accident. The body of the vehicle showed visible damage. Dust coated the frame. The position of the car suggested it had rolled before finally stopping, but when searchers approached the scene, they encountered a detail far more unsettling than the damaged vehicle itself. Daniel Robinson was not there. There was no sign of him inside the Jeep, no body nearby, and no clear trail of footprints leading away from the crash site. It was as if the vehicle had been abandoned in the desert after the accident, leaving behind only silence and absence. The scene immediately raised questions that no one could answer in that moment. Investigators examining the Jeep found evidence suggesting multiple impacts before it came to rest. The airbag had deployed, indicating a significant collision. Yet, despite the visible damage, there were no clear signs that Daniel had suffered a catastrophic injury at the scene. Even more puzzling were the belongings left behind, untouched and undisturbed, as if time had paused inside the vehicle. His wallet, cell phone, and keys all remained inside, items most people would instinctively take if they tried to seek help. The scene felt incomplete, as if something important had been removed before anyone arrived. This uncertainty deepened when analysts reviewed the vehicle data, suggesting the Jeep may have restarted multiple times after the crash, introducing a far more disturbing possibility. If Daniel had crashed the vehicle and been incapacitated, who restarted it? And if he had restarted it himself, why abandon the vehicle with all of his essential belongings still inside? The desert remained silent on that question, but what investigators would soon discover would only deepen the mystery. When a person disappears, investigators usually begin with patterns. They examine the last confirmed movements, the environment, the relationships, and the physical evidence left behind. In the case of Daniel Robinson, that process quickly fell into the hands of the Buckeye Police Department, the local authority responsible for the region where he had last been seen. At first glance, the situation appeared to resemble a remote desert accident. A damaged vehicle had been discovered overturned in rough terrain. The area itself was difficult to navigate, filled with dirt roads, loose rock, and steep desert washes. Under such conditions, a single moment of distraction could send a vehicle rolling into a ravine. For investigators, this explanation initially seemed plausible, but plausibility is not proof. And as the investigation progressed, the the details surrounding the crash began to resist simple interpretation. Police officers documented the crash site carefully. The Jeep Renegade had sustained visible impact damage, and its airbags had deployed, indicating a significant collision sequence. Yet, the physical scene presented an unusual absence. There was no body, no clear blood evidence suggesting a severe injury inside the vehicle, and perhaps most importantly, no obvious trail showing where Daniel might have gone after leaving the crash site. The desert floor preserves footprints remarkably well when conditions are calm. But wind can erase those traces within hours. By the time investigators fully examined the location, days had already passed since Daniel had last been seen. Any fragile evidence may have already been carried away by heat and dust. Still, the unanswered questions began to multiply. Back in the desert town of Buckeye, the case gradually shifted from a missing person investigation to a public mystery. News coverage expanded. Online communities began discussing possible explanations, and at the center of it all stood Daniel's father, David Robinson. Unlike many families who must wait for official updates, David Robinson chose a different path. He entered the desert himself. Within weeks of arriving in Arizona, David began organizing independent search efforts across the same terrain where his son had vanished. Volunteers joined him. Private investigators offered assistance. Drones, off-road vehicles, and search teams started combing through miles of rugged desert landscape. The effort quickly grew into something far larger than a typical missing person search. Over time, thousands of acres surrounding the crash site were explored repeatedly. Teams walked through dry ravines, examined abandoned mining areas, and searched around water channels that sometimes cut through the desert floor during seasonal storms. Helicopters scanned wide sections of terrain from above. Search dogs were brought in to detect possible scent trails. Yet despite the enormous effort, the results remained painfully limited. No confirmed sign of Daniel Robinson was discovered. The absence of evidence created a growing tension between the family and the official investigation. While the Buckeye Police Department continued examining the possibility of an accidental crash followed by disorientation or exposure, Daniel's father began questioning whether the investigation was overlooking critical details. From David Robinson's perspective, several elements of the crash scene simply did not make sense. If Daniel had survived the accident, why had he left behind his phone and wallet? Why had no clear path away from the vehicle been discovered? And how could such a massive search effort fail to uncover even the smallest trace of his son? These concerns eventually led to the involvement of independent accident reconstruction specialists. One such analysis attempted to recreate the movements of the Jeep Renegade during the crash sequence. By examining vehicle data logs, tire marks, and impact damage, experts attempted to determine exactly how the accident had unfolded. The conclusions, however, did not bring clarity. Instead, they introduced even more uncertainty. According to some interpretations of the vehicle data, the Jeep appeared to have experienced multiple ignition cycles after the crash events. In simple terms, the vehicle may have been restarted several times. This raised the possibility that someone had attempted to drive or reposition the car after the initial impacts occurred. If that interpretation was correct, it challenged the idea of a simple accident. Analysts noted irregularities in the vehicle's damage pattern. The direction of impacts and the final resting position did not align with a single rollover. Instead, the evidence suggested multiple collisions from different angles. None of this confirmed foul play, but it also resisted any clean, straightforward explanation. Meanwhile, the desert remained unchanged. The land outside Buckeye stretched endlessly under the sun, marked by thin dirt roads cutting across dry terrain. From above, it looked infinite. A vehicle could travel for miles without encountering another person. It was a place where small events disappeared quickly, yet where unanswered questions could remain buried for years without resolution. For David Robinson, the search became something deeper than investigation. It turned into a refusal to accept silence. He organized volunteer searches, spoke with journalists, and kept attention on his son's case. Teams returned repeatedly to the same areas, scanning under shifting conditions, after storms, and during cooler seasons, hoping the desert might finally reveal what it had concealed. Time passed without resolution. No confirmed trace of Daniel Robinson was ever recovered, and no witness came forward with clear information. The desert held its silence with unsettling consistency. Gradually, investigators and observers began to accept that this case did not fit neatly into a single explanation. If the crash was not entirely accidental, then something else may have occurred, something that left behind almost no physical evidence at all. By then, the case had drawn national attention. True crime communities examined every detail while journalists debated competing theories. Investigators continued working from both official and independent angles. Yet despite the growing focus, the central mystery remained unchanged. A young geologist entered the Arizona desert one morning and never returned. His damaged vehicle was found abandoned, his belongings still inside, and the person who owned them was gone. Then came a shift in perspective that changed how many viewed the case. Some accident specialists suggested the physical evidence did not align with a simple crash followed by disorientation. The pattern of impacts, the restart data, and the vehicle's final position raised doubts. The implication was quiet, but significant. Perhaps the desert had not simply claimed a victim. Perhaps something else had occurred, something still hidden beneath the surface. Years have passed since Daniel Robinson drove into the desert outside Buckeye and vanished without a trace. His vehicle was eventually recovered and his belongings carefully documented by investigators. Search teams crossed miles of harsh, unforgiving terrain under extreme conditions. Yet the most critical piece of the story remains missing. Daniel himself has never been found, leaving behind a silence that continues to unsettle everyone following the case today. When physical evidence fails to provide a clear narrative, investigators often turn to theoretical frameworks. These are not definitive answers, but structured possibilities designed to explain how such a disappearance might unfold. In Daniel Robinson's case, three primary theories continue to dominate discussion. Each offers a different lens through which the mystery can be viewed, yet none fully resolves the questions left behind in the Arizona desert's vast and quiet expanse. The first theory suggests a personal crisis that led to voluntary disappearance. Messages reviewed after Daniel vanished hinted at emotional disappointment following a recent breakup. Some observers believe that isolation, combined with personal stress, may have caused him to withdraw completely. Situations like this do occur, where individuals choose to leave their lives behind. However, such decisions are rarely made without preparation or the presence of essential personal belongings. That is where this theory begins to weaken under closer examination. Daniel's wallet, phone, and keys were all found inside his vehicle, at the crash site. These are items most individuals would take if they intended to disappear intentionally. Their presence suggests something sudden rather than planned. It implies interruption rather than choice, raising doubts about whether Daniel truly left of his own will or under entirely voluntary circumstances. The second theory focuses on the possibility of a desert accident. The damaged Jeep, overturned in rough terrain, supports the idea that Daniel may have crashed while navigating the area. In such extreme environments, disorientation, injury, or dehydration can quickly become fatal. If he attempted to walk for help, the desert could have overwhelmed him. Yet despite extensive searches, no physical trace of him has ever been located. The third theory considers the possibility of foul play. The remote nature of the area allows for encounters far from witnesses or surveillance. Some analysts have questioned irregularities in the vehicle's damage and data logs, suggesting another person might have been involved. Still, no direct evidence confirms this, and so the case remains suspended between explanations. Three theories, none complete. Which one do you believe makes the most sense? From a psychological perspective, disappearances often fall into recognizable behavioral patterns. Analysts frequently examine three broad categories when studying cases like this: voluntary disappearance, accidental death in a natural environment, and opportunistic crime. Voluntary disappearances often show signs of preparation, financial activity, travel plans, or digital traces. In Daniel's case, such indicators are minimal. Accidental deaths in the wilderness typically leave physical evidence over time, yet despite extensive searches, none has been found. Opportunistic crimes in remote areas, however, can leave almost nothing behind. The environment itself can erase tracks, scatter clues, and conceal the truth across vast, unforgiving terrain. None of these psychological patterns fully resolve the mystery of Daniel Robinson, yet each one offers a lens through which investigators attempt to interpret the silence left behind. Beyond psychology lies a deeper layer of reflection that often emerges in unresolved cases. When events remain unexplained for years, people naturally begin searching for meaning through philosophical ideas. In Buddhist thought, life is defined by impermanence. Everything that exists is temporary, subject to change and disappearance. From this perspective, the mystery of a vanished life becomes part of the larger truth that nothing remains fixed or certain. Western philosophy often frames the same uncertainty differently. Thinkers have long emphasized the fragility of human existence. A life can change direction in a single moment, shaped by circumstances beyond control. A wrong turn, a mechanical failure, an unexpected encounter. Eastern philosophical traditions sometimes approach these mysteries through the concept of cause and effect. Every event emerges from a chain of preceding conditions, even if those connections remain invisible to observers. What appears random may simply be a sequence we do not yet understand. Within Christian thought, another perspective appears. Truth, even when hidden, is believed to eventually surface. The moral structure of the world suggests that actions leave echoes, and those echoes will one day reveal the full story behind them. For now, however, the desert remains silent. Yet silence does not prevent investigation from continuing. New investigative directions may still hold potential. Advances in forensic technology could allow renewed analysis of vehicle data systems or environmental traces surrounding the crash site. Satellite imagery from the period around Daniel's disappearance may provide overlooked details about vehicle movements or unusual activity in the area. Expanding the geographic search radius beyond the original crash zone could also reveal clues missed during earlier efforts. In remote environments, events rarely follow perfect patterns. A person who leaves a crash site may travel in unexpected directions depending on terrain, injury, or psychological state. And finally, renewed interviews with individuals connected to Daniel's life during his final weeks might uncover subtle details that once seemed insignificant. Sometimes the smallest observation becomes the key to understanding a much larger puzzle. For now, however, one truth remains unchanged. The family of Daniel Robinson still does not know what happened to him. Years of searching have produced determination, awareness, and public attention, but not closure. Out in the vast deserts of Arizona, the land continues to stretch across the horizon exactly as it did on that morning in June 2021. Wind still moves across the dry ground. Dust still drifts along empty roads. Somewhere within that enormous landscape, the final moments of Daniel Robinson's story remain hidden. If stories like this draw you in, where the questions linger far longer than the answers, consider supporting the channel. A simple like, a share, or a subscription helps bring more of these unsolved mysteries into the light, reaching others who are searching for the truth behind the unknown. Because some crimes leave behind no screams, only silence. And sometimes, that silence speaks louder than any confession ever could. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.